close your eyes for a moment, and imagine something most people never think about. Imagine a world with no streetlights, no phone screens glowing in the dark, no lamp on the bedside table, no city hum bleeding through the window at 3 in the morning. Imagine a world where when night fell, it truly fell. Like a curtain dropped by something enormous and indifferent, blotting out everything you knew about your surroundings, turning the familiar into the unknown in a matter of minutes. That was the world your ancestors lived in, every single night, for hundreds of thousands of years. And tonight, we are going back there. Not as tourists, not as historians flipping through textbooks, but as something closer to what you actually are beneath all the civilization layered on top of you. Because the truth is, the night did not just scare your ancestors. It shaped them. It rewired their brains, built their religions, invented their languages, and left fingerprints so deep inside your biology that you still feel them every time the lights go out, and your mind starts doing things you cannot quite explain. This is the story of the ancient night, and what humans really did inside it. Let us begin with something that might already be happening to you. Something you might have Googled at 2 in the morning while lying awake and wondering what was wrong with you. The first sleep, and the second sleep. For most of human history, people did not sleep the way you were taught to sleep. The idea of collapsing into bed at 10 or 11 at night, and waking up 8 hours later fully refreshed, that is not ancient wisdom. That is a modern invention. A relatively recent one. And the history of sleep tells a story that is far stranger, and honestly far more human, than any doctor has probably told you. Here is what actually happened. When darkness came, and it came fast and total in a world without electricity, early humans would gather close to the fire and begin what we might call the first sleep. This was not a full night's rest. It was more like a long evening nap, lasting somewhere between 3 and 5 hours, beginning shortly after dark and ending somewhere deep in the heart of midnight. Their bodies would follow the rhythm of the earth itself, winding down as the sun sank, cooling as the temperature dropped, and pulling them under into sleep not because they decided to, but because the darkness commanded it. And then, at some point between midnight and 2 in the morning, they would wake up. Not with a jolt, not in a panic, not reaching for a phone to check what time it was. They would simply open their eyes and find themselves in the dark, fully conscious, alert, strangely calm. And what they did in that middle hour, that suspended space between the first and second sleep, reveals something extraordinary about who we were before the modern world told us who to be. They talked. Not about plans or schedules or things they needed to do tomorrow. They talked in the way that human beings only talk when the world has gone completely quiet and no one is performing for an audience. They told stories, remembered dreams, processed grief, made decisions that felt impossible in the noise of the day. Some historical records from medieval Europe actually describe this period with a specific phrase, the watch, and it was treated not as insomnia but as a kind of gift. A private hour that belonged to no one and nothing except the people who were awake inside it. They made love. And here is the part that historian Roger Kirch, who spent 15 years researching pre-industrial sleep, found most fascinating. They interpreted their dreams. The hours between the two sleeps were considered the most spiritually significant hours of the night. The dreams that arrived during the first sleep were believed to carry messages, warnings, visions. And the waking mind that sat between those two sleeps was considered the best possible instrument for understanding what those dreams meant, because it was still half submerged in the world the dream had opened. After this hour of quiet wakefulness, they would return to sleep. The second sleep. Deeper. Heavier. And they would rise with the first light feeling not exhausted, but complete. Now think about what happened when electricity arrived. Thomas Edison, who famously slept very little and seemed almost proud of it, once said that sleep was a waste of time. And the light bulb he helped bring into the world did something that no invention before it had ever managed. It erased the night. Not literally, but functionally. It pushed darkness out of the house, out of the bedroom, and replaced it with a continuous artificial noon that the human brain had no evolutionary language for. The body kept waiting for a darkness that never fully came, kept trying to find its rhythm in a world that had eliminated the thing that rhythm depended on. And so the segmented sleep, that ancient two-part architecture of rest that had served our species for hundreds of thousands of years, collapsed. It became pathologized. The people who woke at 2 in the morning and could not fall back asleep were no longer participants in an ancient ritual. They were insomniacs. They were anxious. They needed treatment. But here is what sleep researchers have started to suspect, and what might genuinely change the way you feel the next time you find yourself awake in the middle of the night. Your body might not be broken. Your body might be ancient. It might be doing exactly what it was designed to do, reaching for a rhythm that electricity stole from it, waiting in the dark for a conversation, for a dream, for the second sleep that your modern schedule does not have room for. The insomnia epidemic of the modern world, and it is genuinely epidemic, may not be a failure of the human body to adapt to modernity. It may be the human body refusing to pretend that 3,000 years of artificial light is enough to overwrite 300,000 years of darkness. Now, let us step further into that darkness. Let us talk about what the mind does when the light disappears and the fire starts to flicker, because this is where the ancient night gets strange. Your ancestors were afraid of the dark, but not the way a child is afraid of the dark after watching a scary movie. They were afraid in a way that was perfectly rational, because the dark was actually dangerous. And the human brain responded to that danger by developing one of its most remarkable and persistent quirks: pareidolia. If you have ever looked at a cloud and seen a face in it, or stared at a wood grain pattern until it arranged itself into something that looked like eyes, or heard your name in the static between radio stations, then you have experienced pareidolia. It is the brain's tendency to find meaningful patterns, especially faces and shapes, in random or ambiguous information. And in the firelit world of our ancestors, it was not a quirk. It was a survival mechanism of the highest order. Here is why. Imagine you are sitting at the edge of a forest at night. The fire is low. The trees are moving, maybe from the wind, maybe from something else. Your brain has two options. Option 1, it assumes the movement is just the wind. Option 2, it assumes the movement is a predator. If it chooses option 1 and it is wrong, you are dead. If it chooses option 2 and it is wrong, you stand up for nothing. You feel a little foolish. And you are still alive. Evolution is brutally practical about this kind of calculation. The brains that survived were the ones that always chose option 2, the ones that saw the predator in the shadow even when there was no predator, because the cost of a false alarm is embarrassment, and the cost of a missed alarm is death. And so the human brain became, quite literally, a machine for seeing things that are not there. A machine tuned to the frequency of threat, constantly scanning the dark for patterns, for eyes, for movement, for anything that could be turned into a face. And at night, around a fire whose light was never steady, that machine went into overdrive. Every shadow on the cave wall was a shape waiting to become something. Every cluster of leaves in the darkness above the firelight was a face looking down. Every gust of wind that made the flame lean sideways through new creatures across the walls, creatures that moved, breathed, reached. And the minds watching those walls were not passive observers. They were active interpreters, desperately searching for meaning in every flicker, because meaning was safety, and the absence of meaning was the most terrifying thing imaginable. So they did what humans always do when the world becomes too large and too dark and too full of unseen things. They invented rituals. Across cultures separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years, from the forests of prehistoric Europe to the grasslands of ancient Africa to the river valleys of early Asia, archaeologists and anthropologists have found evidence of the same instinct. When darkness came and the shadows began to move, people reached for protection. Not weapons, but symbols. Not shields, but ceremony. Some painted their hands and faces with ash from the fire. Not for warmth. Not for camouflage in the daylight sense. But because ash, the residue of fire, was believed to carry the power of the flame even when the flame was not there. To paint yourself in ash was to become firelight made flesh, to become something the darkness could not easily see or claim. There are handprints in cave art across the world that researchers believe were not decorative but protective, a way of marking the boundary between the human world and the dark world pressing in from outside. Some burned specific plants, not for the smoke itself but for the smell, because scent was one of the few things that worked in total darkness. A particular smell could define a territory, could signal to unseen presences that this space was occupied, claimed, defended by something with intention. The use of smoke and incense in almost every major religious tradition in the world traces back to this, to the ancient firelit night and the desperate human need to mark a circle of safety inside the dark. And some did something stranger still. They began to give the shadows names. Because a shadow with a name is a shadow you can negotiate with. A monster you can describe is a monster you can appease. The moment early humans started looking at the dark and saying, "That shape, that feeling, that sound, has a name," they crossed a threshold that changed everything. They were no longer just prey animals huddled against the cold. They were storytellers. And the story they were telling was the oldest one in human history. The world is full of forces I cannot see, and I must find a way to live alongside them. That instinct, that ancient negotiation with the invisible, is the root of every religion, every mythology, every ghost story, every horror film, every superstition, every prayer that has ever been whispered in the dark. It started not in a temple or a cathedral or a philosophy class. It started at the edge of a dying fire, with a human brain doing exactly what it was designed to do, finding faces in the shadows and deciding they needed to be dealt with. Now we come to the fire itself. Because the fire was not just warmth and light. The fire was the first technology that changed what the night meant, and in changing the night, it changed what it meant to be human. Before fire, the night was simple. It was danger. It was the hours when everything that wanted to eat you became active, and you became prey. The only strategy was stillness and silence and hiding. But fire pushed the predators back, not permanently, not completely, but enough. Enough to create something that had never existed before in the history of life on Earth. Free time after dark. Think about what that means. For every animal on the planet, every moment of consciousness is consumed by survival. Finding food, avoiding death, reproducing, competing. There is no leftover time. There is no moment when a wolf sits down and asks itself what a cloud looks like or wonders what happens after death. But when early humans gathered around a fire and the immediate demands of survival paused for a few hours, something extraordinary happened in the space that opened up. They started talking about things that did not exist. During the day, language was practical. It had to be. You did not have time for abstraction when you were tracking an animal, or watching for snakes or reading the weather. Daytime language was direct and immediate. Watch out. Come here. Look at that. But at night, around the fire, with the dark held at a safe distance and the body finally allowed to rest, language started doing something it had never done before. It began to reach for things it could not touch. The moon rising over the treeline was not just a light source anymore. It was something. It moved with intention. It changed its shape according to a pattern that seemed to respond to the world below it. Women's bodies followed its rhythm. Tides answered it. Animals behaved differently under its full light. And the minds sitting around the fire, the same minds that had just spent all day being perfectly practical and efficient, began to ask the question that would eventually generate every philosophy and every religion and every science in human history. Why? Why does the moon change? Why does the sun come back every morning? Why do some animals die and others live? Why do some people dream of events before they happen? Why does the fire hurt when you touch it but comfort you from a distance? Why do we feel things we cannot explain? Why are we here? These questions could only be asked at night. Not because the night made people more intelligent, but because the night gave them the first real silence in which those questions could form and be heard. The day was too loud with necessity. The night was the only laboratory where the abstract mind could work. And what they built in that laboratory is almost impossible to overstate. The first gods were born at night. Not in temples, not through organized religion, not through theology or doctrine. They were born in the space between a dying fire and a dark sky full of stars, in the mind of someone who looked up and felt, with total certainty, that something up there was looking back. That feeling, that ancient overwhelming sense of being watched by something immense and intentional, is so hardwired into the human nervous system that modern people still report it in the strangest places. In empty churches, at the edge of oceans, in forests at night, standing alone on a mountain, the feeling that the universe is not indifferent, that something in it notices you. That feeling did not come from scripture. It came from the night, from the fire and the dark and the silence, and the mind that could not stop searching for faces, even in the stars. Folktales began the same way. Someone around the fire said, "Let me tell you something that happened," and then changed the story just enough to make it mean something larger than the event itself. The animal they hunted became a symbol. The storm that almost killed them became a lesson. The stranger who helped them became a spirit. The night transformed lived experience into mythology because mythology is what happens when a practical animal is given enough silence to reflect. Without those nights, without the fire and the dark and the questions and the fear and the storytelling, there is no Homer, no Bible, no Quran, no Shakespeare, no cinema, no novel. The entire architecture of human culture sits on the foundation of those ancient firelit nights, when survival temporarily paused and imagination took over. And now we go deeper. Literally. Because some of those early humans were not satisfied with the firelight and the open sky. Some of them picked up their torches and walked into the earth. The painted caves of prehistoric humanity are among the most astonishing things our species has ever created and also among the most mysterious. Lascaux in France, Altamira in Spain, Chauvet, whose paintings are over 30,000 years old and still so vivid and so alive that modern artists stand in front of them and feel something very close to humility. These caves contain images of extraordinary sophistication, animals rendered with such accuracy and such motion that they seem about to step off the wall. Horses mid-gallop, bison turning their heads, deer with antlers so precisely observed you can almost count the points. But here is the question that archaeologists have been asking for decades and that no one has fully answered. Why were these paintings so deep inside the caves? Not near the entrance where the light reached. Not in the chambers where people might have lived or sheltered. The most significant paintings, the most carefully executed and most spiritually charged images, were found in the most remote and difficult to access parts of the cave systems. Places you could only reach by crawling through narrow passages in total darkness. Places where even with a torch the journey would have been disorienting and frightening. Places where the silence was absolute and the darkness was a physical presence. Why would anyone go there to paint? One theory has emerged from the overlap of archaeology and neuroscience, and it is one of those ideas that once you hear it you cannot quite unhear it. The theory is that they were not painting in the caves because the caves were convenient. They were painting in the caves because the caves were capable of doing something to the human mind that no other place could do. Total sensory deprivation. When you remove light completely, when there is no sound except the sound of your own breathing and your own heartbeat, when the body has no external information to process, the brain does not go quiet. It goes the opposite direction. It begins generating its own images. Geometric patterns at first, spirals and grids and dots. Then more complex forms. Animals. Faces. Landscapes. The neuroscience of this is well established. Researchers studying sensory deprivation tanks have documented the same progression in modern subjects in controlled laboratory conditions. Ancient humans did not have laboratories, but they had caves. And the theory suggests that the people who crawled into those deep dark chambers were not simply artists who needed a blank wall. They were seeking an altered state. A state in which the boundary between the visible world and whatever lay behind it seemed to dissolve. In which the images that surfaced from the depths of the mind felt not like imagination but like vision, like revelation, like contact with something real and alive on the other side of ordinary perception. The animals they painted were not memories of hunts. They were in the belief system of the people painting them, living beings from another layer of reality. Beings that could be reached through the wall if you approached in the right state of mind, in the right darkness, with the right intention. The act of painting was not representation. It was invocation. It was an attempt to pull the spiritual animal through the stone membrane between worlds and bring its power into the human realm. They were not decorating a cave. They were opening a door. And when you stand in front of those images today, when you hold your torch up and watch the firelight move across the painted bison and the horses seem to run and the deer seem to turn, you feel something. Something old and wordless and large. Something that does not care how educated you are or how rational you consider yourself. Something that recognizes the work being done on those walls even across 30,000 years of distance. Because the hands that made those marks were reaching for exactly what part of you is still reaching for. Every time you lie in the dark and cannot sleep. Every time you look at a shadow and feel your heart rate rise for no reason you can name. Every time you sit around a fire, feel the conversation deepen in ways it never does in daylight. You are not a modern person who occasionally experiences primitive impulses. You are a very old creature who has been wearing a modern disguise for a few hundred years. The darkness remembers. And somewhere underneath everything the civilization has built, somewhere underneath the electrical light, and the white noise machines, and the sleep apps, and the melatonin gummies, so do you. The ancient night did not end when Edison flipped the switch. It retreated. It went quiet. It learned to wait. And every night, when the screens finally go dark and the house goes still and the ceiling above you becomes the same formless black that your ancestors stared up at from the floor of a cave or the grass of an open plain, it comes back. Listen.